Welcome to the fifth video in our series, Cosmological Investigations. We are going to be talking about new cosmological arguments. These are arguments that are developed based on the latest discoveries in logic. These discoveries make use of 20th century advances and are thinking about the logic of possibility and necessity. And from these advances, there have been new cosmological arguments developed. And so in this video, I'm going to give you a survey of these type of arguments. So the purpose of these arguments, these are modal cosmological arguments, is to make a cosmological argument using the recent technology of possibility logic. When I say the recent technology, I'm talking about developments in our understanding about logic based on getting very clear definitions of possibility and necessity that characterize certain axioms, and then deducing theorems from those axioms. This is a field called modal logic. Arguments built using modal logic are modal arguments. A cosmological argument using modal logic is a modal cosmological argument. So here's the big picture. Developments in logic reveal a certain connection between certain possibilities and certain actualities. Modal cosmological arguments take advantage of this connection by showing that if certain things are possible, then we can deduce that certain things are actual. And in particular, if we can show that it is possible for there to be a necessary part of reality, a necessary foundation of reality, then we can use the latest logic to deduce there is actually a necessary foundation of reality. So, given these developments, we can now build a certain kind of argument that links these possibilities with these actualities. Let me give you a bird's eye view of a modal argument. The first premise is that certain structures, causal or explanatory structures, are at least possible. So we're going to leave open whether these structures are actual, but they are at least possible. And I'll say more in a bit about what that possibility could mean. The next premise is that those structures could only be possible if some necessary reality were also possible. The idea is that there's some necessary reality that's required for those kind of structures, so that if those structures are possible, then a necessary reality would also be possible. And so then it would follow that a necessary reality is possible from those premises. But now a necessary reality is the kind of reality that is either necessarily real or it's impossible. This is where the logic of possibility and necessity comes in. So if a necessary reality is actually possible, well then it's not impossible, and so therefore the only other option is that it's necessarily real. And that's the conclusion here. A necessary reality is necessarily real, and so actually real. So this is the general structure of the argument. We are going to have a closer look at each part. So let's focus first on the first part, the first premise here. Certain structures are at least possible. I'll give a few examples of this, 3 examples. First, you might think that it's possible for there to be a finite chain of causes. So this premise leaves open whether the actual chain of causes is finite. The premise is just that it's possible for it to be finite. Now, what does this term possible mean? There are different notions of possibility. For our purposes, I'm going to think of possibility as consistent with any necessary truths of reason. A necessary truth of reason would be like 1 + 1 = 2. When you understand the terms used to express the proposition, your mind can see that the proposition is true. So any proposition that's consistent with the necessary truths of reason, I'm going to call that possible. So this is a kind of minimal notion of possibility here. Possibly, consistent with reason, there is a finite chain of causes. So that would be an example of a premise that would express a certain possible structure of reality. Now, I don't mean to suggest that this premise is uncontroversial. One can debate whether it is even possible for there to be a finite chain of causes. But the thought here is that this premise is more modest than the claim that there must be a finite chain of causes. And so if we can build an argument using this more modest premise, then the argument itself is more modest. A second example of a structure that might be possible is that all contingent states of existence have some explanation. So previously, when we looked at the contingency argument, we considered the premise that contingent things have some explanation. Well, this premise is more modest. It just says that possibly for any contingent states of existence, those states have an explanation. Another idea is that possibly for every fact about the existence of contingent things, there is possibly an explanation of that fact. So here we have two possibilities. The idea here is that possibly, maybe there's some possible world where every fact in that world about contingent things possibly has an explanation. Now you might be thinking, okay, well, how do we make use of these possibilities? How can these possibility premises be part of an argument for an actually existing necessary thing? Well, that's where the next part of the argument comes in. This part of the argument goes from the possible structures to a necessary reality. So how does this work? Well, let's go through the three examples. Example 1, possible finite chains. Here's the argument. Possibly there is a finite chain of causes. Premise 2, which is the causal link premise. The first member of a causal chain cannot be merely contingent. If that's right, and if it's possible for there to be a finite chain of causes, then it follows that it's possible for there to be a first cause that's not contingent, but that is instead a necessary thing. It exists necessarily. Okay, so now how do we go from possibly there is a necessary thing to actually there is a necessary thing? Well, we've already considered a link from the logic of the possibility of necessity. The idea is that necessary things can't possibly exist unless they actually exist. Let me draw this out a bit more. So we have the premise, possibly there is a necessary thing. Suppose that's right. What follows from that? Well, a necessary thing is the kind of thing that's either necessary or impossible. There's no middle ground when it comes to necessary things. Now, this premise here is actually deducible from the system of logic called S5. And if you're interested in seeing that deduction, go to my website, joshualrasmussen.com/S5 to see the deduction. Here I want to just note that this deduction makes good sense of our particular concept of possibility as being consistent with necessary truths of reason. To my knowledge, there is no controversy over this system of logic when applied to this minimal notion of possibility. In fact, we can think of S5 as providing a definition of the kind of concepts in play when we're talking about possibility and necessity. There are some controversies over S5, the system of logic, when applied to other notions of possibility and necessity. For a fuller treatment of this system of logic, I would encourage you to check out the Stanford Encyclopedia page on modal logic. Or Alexander Proust and I have a chapter in our book Necessary Existence, where we discuss and motivate this system of logic. Okay, now the next step is that a necessary thing is not an impossible thing. That comes from the very first premise here, that possibly there is a necessary thing. So if that's possible, then it's not impossible. And if a necessary thing is not impossible, then the only other option is that it's actually necessary. Therefore, a necessary thing is actually necessary. And if it's necessary, that means it's actually real. Whatever is necessarily real is actually real. So there we have the conclusion, a necessary thing is real. So this is an argument that goes from the possibility of this kind of thing to the actual existence of this kind of thing. Okay, let's look again at how we might argue from possible structures to the possible existence of a necessary thing. I'm going to look at two more examples just to illustrate this general kind of argument. So the next example is from possible explanations. Premise 1, possibly all contingent states of existence have some explanation. Premise 2, an explanation of the contingent state of all contingent things, of there being all of them, cannot be solely in terms of contingent things. This premise is supposed to be a general truth that applies in any possible world. In any possible world, an explanation of the total of contingent things is not going to be in terms of those very contingent things, because that would be circular. Now, if we want to be more modest, we could say that at least it's possible for there to be an external or non-circular explanation of any particular contingent state of existence. And that will still be enough to give us this conclusion, which is that possibly there is a necessary thing. Because the idea is that an external explanation of contingent things will not be in terms of those contingent things, but will instead be in terms of some non-contingent or necessary thing. So this is the critical premise then from which we can argue that therefore there is a necessary thing. Again, because a necessary thing is the kind of thing that's either impossible or necessary. And if it's necessary, then it's actually real. Another way that you can think about this inference from the possible necessary thing to the actual necessary thing is in terms of possible worlds. Imagine that this here is a possible world, and this is a possible world. And this is a possible world over here, and here's one more world right here. You can think of a necessary thing as something that exists in every possible world. So if it's possible that there's a necessary thing, that means that there's some possible world in which, relative to that world, a necessary thing exists in all the other worlds. So if let's say that this is the actual world, and we have a premise that possibly there's a necessary thing. Now let me be clear, this premise that possibly there's a necessary thing doesn't say that possibly there is and possibly there isn't. It says at least there's a possible world in which there is a necessary thing. And if a necessary thing can only exist in a world, if it spans all the worlds, then it follows that if a necessary thing is in one of the possible worlds, then it is therefore in all the other possible worlds as well. Now this expression of the argument in terms of possible worlds is actually unnecessary. We don't even need the language of possible worlds. In the link that I gave in the previous slide, I show a deduction from the axioms of S5 logic that isn't even in terms of possible worlds. However, talking in terms of possible worlds can help us to sort of visualize the inference here. And so that's why I think it can be helpful. Okay, let's do one more example of a possible structure or possible scenario. Example 3, possible explanations. I got this idea from an email from Alexander Proust years ago when we were working on our book, Necessary Existence. And in those days, we were just collecting arguments that would be relevant to whether there is a necessary thing. He sent me an email suggesting that maybe we could run an argument in terms of a very weak principle of explanation. What I'm going to present here is not exactly what he presented, but it's in the same basic spirit of his idea. So here's the premise. Possibly, for every fact about the existence of contingent things, for our purposes, we can think of a fact minimally as just some truth. So this is saying that for every truth about the existence of contingent things, there is a possible explanation of that truth. So now, how do we go from these possibilities to an actual necessary thing? Well, to complete the argument, I'm going to consider two cases. The first case is the case where there are some contingent things. So go to any possible world where there are some contingent things. Then the fact that there are those contingent things, that number of contingent things, that's only going to be explicable to avoid circularity, not in terms of some contingent things, but in terms of a necessary thing. A necessary thing can explain why there's that number of contingent things. Now let me just be clear about what I'm trying to do here. This first premise is a possibility premise. We can think of this in terms of possible worlds. In some possible world, for every fact about the existence of contingent things, there's a possible explanation of that fact. Well, we can divide all possible worlds into two types. Either the possible world has some contingent things, or it doesn't have any contingent things. If it has some contingent things, then the idea is that there's only possibly an explanation of the fact that it has that number of contingent things if there's possibly a necessary thing. The second case is the case where there are no contingent things. In that case, the number of contingent things is going to be 0. And the thought here is that the fact that there are 0 contingent things is only going to be explicable in terms of a necessary thing. After all, we can't explain there being 0 contingent things by saying that there can't be contingent things, for there can be contingent things. Again, by can, I mean just consistent with the principles of reason. It is consistent with reason that there be some contingent things, such as things that we see in our world. Those things are contingent things. Those are real possibilities. Well, of course they're possibilities because they're actual things. So if you're following all this, and I know this is not an easy argument to follow, but the idea here, the basic idea is that whether we go to a world that has contingent things or that doesn't have contingent things, there's going to be some contingent fact that can only be possibly explained in terms of a necessary thing. So that's the result I have here. In every world, some fact can only be explained in terms of a necessary thing. And if that's right, it follows that possibly there is some necessary thing. And then from here, we finish the argument as before. Necessary thing is the kind of thing that's only possible if it's actually real. Therefore, there is a necessary thing. Now, my goal here is not to provide complete defenses of these arguments, but rather to illustrate the kinds of arguments that are available using the logic of necessity and possibility. So here's a summary of the argument. Certain structures are at least possible. Those structures could only be possible if some necessary reality were also possible. Therefore, a necessary reality is possible. A necessary reality is either necessary or impossible. Therefore, a necessary reality is necessary and so real. Now, I'm going to conclude this video by considering a common objection that I sometimes hear. The objection is based on reversing the argument. Some of you may be familiar with the reverse ontological argument. The ontological argument is like this modal cosmological argument in that it seeks to show something actual from something possible. In the ontological argument, there's this possibility premise. For example, possibly there is a perfect being. And from the possibility premise, the thought is that we can argue that there's actually a perfect being if a perfect being would have necessary existence. This kind of argument uses the same logic of possibility, the S5 logic. However, in response to the ontological argument, a common response is to reverse the argument by suggesting that, look, if it's possible that there's a perfect thing or a necessary thing, then it's also possible for there to be no perfect thing or no necessary thing. Or at the very least, we have no better reason to think that the one possibility holds over the other. And this reverse argument is thought to then stalemate the original ontological argument. Now, we can apply the same type of argument to the cosmological argument that we've just given. The argument goes like this. The contingent universe possibly has no cause. That's the reverse premise. So if you say possibly the contingent universe has a cause, then why not equally say that possibly it has no cause? Why accept one possibility over the other? But if the contingent universe possibly has no cause, then possibly it's not caused by a necessary thing. But then it follows that there is no necessary thing. And here we just use the same logic of necessity that we've been using. A necessary thing is the kind of thing that's either necessary or impossible. So if it's possible that there is no necessary thing, then necessary thing is not necessary, and therefore it's actually impossible, and therefore not real. There's actually no necessary thing. So what should we say about this argument, this reversal? Well, I think this argument does help to clarify the modal cosmological argument, in particular to show how the modal cosmological argument is importantly different from the ontological argument. So I have two things to say, two replies. First is that this second line here actually does not follow from the first line. Let's say that the contingent universe possibly has no cause. In fact, let's go further. Let's say the contingent universe actually has no cause. Let's say our universe came into being completely uncaused. Would it follow that there's no necessary thing capable of producing contingent things? Well, no, that does not follow. To see this, imagine that this here is the actual world. And imagine that in the actual world, our universe came into being uncaused. Well, it doesn't follow that there isn't also a necessary thing in this world that could be capable of causing something. And in fact, the modal cosmological argument seeks to show that at least there's a necessary thing that's capable of causing things in some possible world. And then, because a necessary thing can only be in a possible world if it spans all the worlds, it follows that necessary thing is also in the actual world. And that's consistent with the actual contingent universe not having a cause. So that's the first thing that I want to point out, is that actually this argument is not even a valid argument. This line does not follow from this line. And that shows how this modal argument is importantly different from the ontological argument. In the ontological argument, you can create a valid reversal. But in this case, this reversal is not a valid argument. And second, and I think even more fundamentally, the reverse argument is not as plausible as the original argument, because the evidence of possible causes is greater than the evidence of possible no causes. We have all sorts of evidence that contingent things at least possibly have a cause. We have the evidence from experience. And in addition, I think there's a kind of irrelevant difference argument applied to possible causes that doesn't apply to possible no causes. The argument goes like this. Possibly there's a cause of a contingent shoe. The difference between a contingent shoe and any other contingent thing does not appear to be relevant to possibly having a cause. It seems like if a contingent shoe could have a cause, then a contingent anything could possibly have a cause. But going in the reverse, we don't have this because we have no clear examples of contingent things that have no cause or even possibly have no cause. And so we can't run an irrelevant difference argument in the reverse. So in summary, I think that this objection, rather than hurt the modal argument, helps to display its advantage. It has an advantage over other arguments that seem susceptible to reversal. Now, maybe there is some way to reverse the argument, but as far as I've seen, I've never seen a reversal of the modal cosmological argument that is as well supported as the original modal cosmological argument. Now, we have covered a lot of ground, and I don't want to suggest that any of this ground is easy. In fact, I think that there's a lot of room for further exploration. I want to leave you with some considerations about some territory to explore in modal cosmological arguments. And in particular, I want to point to some territory surrounding the second stage of modal arguments, the stage that identifies the nature of the necessary thing. For example, it might be that not only are there possible explanations of contingent things, but maybe there's possible explanations of other things like shapes or limits or imperfections. By focusing on these other kinds of things, you can explore a pathway, a modal pathway from the possible explanation of these things to an ultimate reality that transcends these things, that transcends shapes, limits, and imperfections. In my book, How Reason Can Lead to God, I conclude the book with a modal cosmological argument, a modal argument from explanations that focuses on limits and imperfections. And there I give a second stage of the modal cosmological argument. I haven't seen a lot of discussion of the second stage. This seems to be a ripe area for exploration. It can help to think about the general structure for this kind of exploration. So here's a general structure for a kind of modal cosmological argument. First, the instantiation of some category Q, whether that's shapes, limits, contingent things, imperfections, is possibly explained or explicable. You might motivate this by irrelevant differences between instances of Q. You might think that if a triangle shape could possibly be explained, then any possible shape could possibly be explained. The next premise is a linking premise that links Q to another kind of thing. The idea here is that the instantiation of Q is only explicable if some instance of P is possible where P is not Q. Next, if P is the kind of thing that is only necessary or impossible, then we can conclude that an instance of P is actually necessary and so real. In my argument from limits, I made the argument that something that transcends limits would be absolutely perfect, and that something that's absolutely perfect would have necessary existence. And so it would be the kind of thing that either spans all the possible worlds and so is necessary, or it would be an impossible kind of thing. Now, I don't want to land too decisively here. My goal is just to point to the general structure of this kind of argument and to point to the structure as a place ripe for further exploration. Well, thank you guys again for your attention. We covered so much ground in these videos so far. If you've made it this far, I want to congratulate you. You have considered things that few people ever consider. I hope these considerations will serve you on your journey.